Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Lee Farrow, and I am here today to talk to you about the Alaska Purchase. Here we go. One of the, well, I guess I should say also that I teach at Auburn University at Montgomery in Montgomery, Alabama. I am a professor of Russian history. And I've been working here 23 years. And I was just talking before before we began the presentation about how I definitely chose the right profession because I have been interested in Russian history for a very, very long time, and it has never stopped being interesting to me. I love traveling and learning about Russia's past and present, and it is constantly fascinating to me. And on that note, I will then explain how I got interested in this project in the first place. So that's a question that people ask me very often. How did I become interested in the topic of the Alaska Purchase? And the truth is, I was on a cruise with my family, and we were going to Alaska, and I realized I didn't know very much about the Alaska Purchase, except what little I'd been taught in school. And so I decided I would pick up a book on it and try and brush up on my history on that particular topic. And when we stopped in the first port in Sitka, there were no books on it. The bookstore had nothing on it, and that really piqued my interest. And so when I got home from the trip, I did a little bit of research and discovered that the last book had been written, at least in English, in 1975, and it was really a rather academic book. And so I decided that I would write a new version, something more updated, and something that was more approachable for a general audience. One of the things that I looked at, of course, and you know, if we were in the same room together, I might use these questions as a prompt for discussion, right? What are some of the American myths about Russia, or rather about the Alaska Purchase? What are some of the Russian myths about the Alaska Purchase? And what do most people know? And I can tell you, in the United States, most people just know a very few things. They know that it was sometimes referred to as Seward's Folly, or so they think. They know that we bought it for $7.2 million, and they know that we bought it from Russia, and that's about all they know. And so obviously there is a lot more to the story than that. And that is what I decided to explore in my book. So, in the wee hours of March 30th, 1867, the United States signed a treaty to purchase Russia's North American colony, North American possessions, adding some 580,000 square miles to the ever-expanding nation in one fell swoop. Over the next few days, as the sale became public, politicians and citizens in both the United States and the nations of Europe expressed surprise and concern. There had been no public discussion of a Russian-American treaty, and so the whole deal seemed to transpire overnight. And this gave the feeling to many people that something underhanded had happened, or something suspicious had happened, right? But in fact, there really was a very long history behind the Alaska Purchase. But few people outside of a very small circle of men knew this. Now, the first real conversation of any significance about the sale of Russian America goes back to the time of the Crimean War. Officials in Russia quickly realized that their North American colony was at risk of seizure by the British, and so they hatched a plan. In 1854, an agent for the Russian American Company, which oversaw the Russian colony, came up with the idea of executing a fictitious sale of Russian America to a group of San Francisco merchants. But before the scheme could be carried out, Great Britain agreed to exclude Russian America from the war because it was afraid that Russia might just give it outright to the United States if pressure was applied. Now, although this first exploration of an Alaska sail went nowhere, it stimulated curiosity in the United States and raised the possibility that Russia might actually consider selling the territory sometime in the future. The New York Herald, for example, urged the United States to buy Russian America as soon as possible and warned, delay will preclude the possibility of our acquiring it and will in all probability have the effect of aiding Great Britain in its promised conquest and adding further strength to a rival whose power is already but too formidable on this continent. All of this speculation ultimately led two officials in Washington to approach the Russian minister to the United States, whose name was Edward de Stoeckel, about the possibility of an actual sale. Stoeckel, however, told them that the Russian government was not interested. The defeat of Russia in the Crimean War, however, changed all that. The war highlighted Russia's need for reform in a variety of areas, especially its military. But it also led some Russian officials to reevaluate Russia's imperial ambitions. One of these, for example, Grand Duke Constantine, brother of the new Tsar Alexander II, argued that Russia should sell its North American possessions, citing the declining value of the colony, the needs of the Russian treasury, and the threat of American expansion. In response to this, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alexander Gorchakov, began to investigate Constantine's claim, and after consulting several people, concluded that a sale might eventually be possible, but not until the Russian-American company's charter expired in 1861. In the meantime, even Russian Minister Stoeckel began to reconsider his position on a sale. In 1857, he wrote to the government in St. Petersburg that he was fearful that the actions of the Russian-American company might harm Russian-American relations. He was also worried about rumors that Mormons were planning to relocate to Russian America. Over the next few years, there continued to be conversations and tentative probings on the idea of a sale. The Russian government increasingly recognized how vulnerable its remote colony was. One official argued that America's belief in manifest destiny would determine the future. He wrote, "Anyone who has lived in the North American continent cannot fail to understand instinctively that this principle is entering more and more into the blood of the people, and that new generations are sucking it in with their mother's milk." Stoeckel echoed this concern about Russian America's vulnerability, stating, "Any maritime power with which we shall be at war could take them from us." Now, before these tentative probings could go anywhere, however, the Civil War erupted in the United States, putting all such conversations on the back burner. The Russian-American relationship did improve during this tumultuous period, however, laying the foundations for a perceived friendship that would last several decades. While France and Great Britain contemplated mediating or otherwise interfering in the Civil War, Russia refused to get involved. Instead, in 1863, Russia sent a fleet to the United States to visit, a gesture which was perceived which was perceived by the United States then and later as a sign of friendship. In fact, Russia likely had an ulterior motive in sending her fleet. Earlier that year, an uprising in the Polish section of the Russian Empire had occurred, and though Russia had successfully put down the rebellion, it feared retaliation by the British and French, who might try and trap Russia's fleet in its own waters. The journey of the Russian fleet to the United States was likely a strategic move to avoid this. But whatever Russia's real intent, perception is reality. And many Americans would remember the Russian visit with fondness and gratitude for years to come. When Tsar Alexander's son, Grand Duke Alexis, came to visit in 1871 and 72, the visit of the fleet will be cited again and again in welcome speeches and newspaper articles as proof of Russia's friendship for the United States. There was one other issue that brought Russia and the United States together on the Alaska deal, a shared distrust of Great Britain. We do not have time here to go into the history of this animosity on either side, but suffice to say that both Russia and the United States had reasons to dislike and distrust Great Britain. And this shared feeling toward the world's greatest naval power was a very strong factor in the Russian-American relationship. Now, all of this background brings us to the story of the actual sale. In the fall of 1866, Stoeckel returned to Russia for a visit, and he was immediately approached by Grand Duke Constantine about whether the American government was still interested in buying Russian America. When Stoeckel confirmed that it was, Constantine and his supporters began to convince the Tsar to sell. In mid-December of 1866, Alexander II authorized the sale, and Stoeckel returned to the United States with instructions to begin negotiations. Now, Stoeckel arrived in New York in mid-February 1867. And over the next few weeks, while he recovered from an injured ankle, he initiated contact with Secretary of State William Seward. Seward had served at the side of Abraham Lincoln and had even been injured during the same assassination plot that killed the president. Seward was known to be an ardent expansionist and had in fact mentioned the eventual acquisition of Russian America more than once. In 1860, for example, Seward had said in a speech in St. Paul, Minnesota, "Standing here and looking far off into the Northwest, I see the Russian as he busily occupies himself in establishing seaports and towns and fortifications. And I can say, go on and build up your outposts all along the coast. They will yet become the outposts of my own country." It's a very arrogant statement from Seward, I think. Now, Stoeckel and Seward met several times between March 11th and March 30th, discussing the price and other specifics of the treaty. There were several points to be negotiated. Stoeckel expected the United States to assume the obligations of the Russian-American company. Seward said it would not. Seward did, however, want the warehouses and other buildings that belonged to the company to be part of the deal. Stoeckel agreed, but asked that the purchase price be raised to $7 million. The two men also agreed that the United States would pay for the territory 10 months after the signing of the treaty. During this time, Seward obtained the approval of President Andrew Johnson and his cabinet. But beyond those few men, sorry, I forgot to click through these. Beyond these few men, no one else was aware of the discussions taking place. Once Seward and Stoeckel had drafted a treaty, Stoeckel cabled it to St. Petersburg to receive the Tsar's blessing. The Tsar approved the treaty, but has some requests of his own. He asked that the payment be made earlier and in London rather than Washington, D.C., and that the Russian-American company's contract to provide ice to San Francisco be honored. With the Tsar's approval, the men could now move quickly to finalize the treaty. On the evening of March 29th, 1867, they called together their secretaries and clerks. Seward also summoned Charles Sumner to his home to fill him in on what was happening. Sumner was chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and his support would be critical in the ultimate success of the treaty. Sumner took the news in stride, but did not commit to his support and went home. In the early hours of March 30th, 1867, Seward and Stoeckel worked out the final details, including the agreement that the United States would pay $7.2 million as soon as the House of Representatives approved appropriation. Seward would not agree to the Tsar's requests for an earlier payment, nor to honor the Russian-American company's existing obligations. As a consolation for these rejected requests, however, Seward added $200,000 to the final purchase price. The treaty was written out in 2 copies and signed and witnessed at about 4 a.m. And this is a famous painting by the painter Emanuel Lutze, who portrayed this important event. The painting is actually incorrect. However, it shows Sumner present for this signing, and he actually was not. His part in the purchase of Alaska would come in the ratification process that followed. And here is the treaty, both in English and in Russian. Now, popular lore about the Alaska purchase tells us that the American public was against the acquisition, mocking the idea as Seward's folly, Seward's icebox, or Wall Russia. This popular version of the story, however, is wrong. In general, American public opinion, or at least as much as we can gauge about American public opinion by looking at newspapers of the period, was either in favor of the purchase or rather neutral about it. Many papers praised the acquisition, emphasizing Russia's abundance in furs, fish, and minerals. Many also recognized its usefulness in facilitating trade with Asia. Here are just a few of the positive comments that appeared in the American press. So you can see that for the most part, these are kind of positive comments. Now, there was a little opposition. The greatest opposition came from one newspaper, and this was Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. And here are some of the negative comments here, right? Certainly not worth $7 million, a frozen desert of a colony, that vulgar sense of national honor, which mistakes size for splendor. That's a very good quote. But even the New York Tribune eventually came around to accept the idea. And as I said, a few of these other papers had negative comments, but they were few compared to the more positive comments that were expressed in the press. The other source of opposition came, not surprisingly, from politicians on Capitol Hill, whose views were tied up with personal and political animosities. Some in Washington were opposed to the idea of expansionism, either for security or financial reasons. Some pointed out that money could be better spent in other ways, such as assisting in the South's recovery. So, of course, it's important to realize that this is only a couple years after the end of the Civil War. So for many people, it seemed a waste of money to buy Alaska when so much of the South needed rebuilding. Railroads and other things had been destroyed, right? So many people thought this is money misspent. Finally, there were some people who hated it just because they hated its advocates, Seward and Johnson. Now, one of the things that has not been looked at before in great detail until my book is the reactions on the international scene. And it's interesting to see the way various countries reacted to the news of the Russian-American treaty. So there were also concerns and opposition on the international scene. Europe in the 1860s was a rapidly changing landscape, fueled by nationalism in its various forms and international rivalry that was usually a byproduct. As Otto von Bismarck pursued his goal of German unification, he launched Prussia into a brief but decisive war with Austria and came close to provoking war with France in 1867 over the future of Luxembourg. During this same period, as you'll recall, Italy was engaged in its own process of unification and eagerly took advantage of the instability in Europe to gain territory from Austria, declaring Victor Emmanuel the first king of unified Italy. As Germany and Italy consolidated their holdings and power, Austria's path was in an opposite direction. Faced with defeat by Prussia and challenges from the Magyar population within its own borders, the Habsburg government compromised in 1867 and created a dual monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the midst of this international turmoil, the sudden announcement that Russian America had been ceded to the United States elicited a variety of reactions across Europe. Several U.S. officials serving in Europe remarked that the news had taken everyone completely by surprise. William W. Murphy, who was the U.S. consul in Frankfurt on Main, wrote that it was astonishing for what deep and exciting impression the news of the purchase had produced among the different political circles of Europe. Cassius Clay, writing from St. Petersburg, told Seward that had the Alaska negotiations not been kept secret, he felt certain there would have been energetic protests and possibly armed intervention to prevent it. The friendly relations between England and France, Clay believed, began in a common agreement to limit American power on its own continent and elsewhere. But, quote, the strange and expected good alliance between Russia and America has taken them by surprise and disabled all their projects. Many in Europe feared that the Alaska Purchase and the evolving Russian-American relationship that it foretold was a portent of bad things to come. Murphy reported that while the liberal press of Europe dispassionately viewed the sale as a mutually beneficial agreement between two countries, the conservative press felt very uneasy and vexed. In their eyes, the low selling price hinted that there would be other compensations, either actual assistance to Russia for the satisfaction of her ambitions on another scene of action, or passive support for territorial changes on European soil. There were rumors that the Alaska deal included America's promise to back Russia up on its ambition to abolish the Black Sea Clause from the Treaty of Paris. The Austrian paper, the Neue Freie Presse, for example, acknowledged this concern a few days after the sale. We are told that the government of the United States has obligated itself in an agreement for the cession of Russian America in support of the Russian government in the Orient and using the American Navy if necessary. So you can certainly see why European governments might have been alarmed given these suggestions. Even Karl Marx had something to say about the Alaska Purchase, and he declared, from the economic side, this acquisition for the present is not worth a cent. But thanks to this, the Yankees will cut England off from the sea from one side and hasten the annexation of all British North America to the United States. That's where the dog is buried. And it's important to remember that this was a great concern in Great Britain and its North American colonies. They were concerned that the Alaska Purchase would facilitate or even encourage American annexation of sections of British North America. And this is, of course, the period of Canadian Confederation. And there were certainly those who opposed Confederation, believing that the United States might offer a better future than a British Confederation. So it certainly was part of that conversation. The French press also expressed concern. The newspaper Le Temps observed that the Russian acquisition would have particular significance for British America, stating, "Only the English provinces now stand between the Americans and the realization of their proud program." But the paper also declared that the importance of the Alaska Purchase was not limited to the New World. The cession of Russian America was consistent with Russia's emergence from isolation and had gained the growing nation two things: money for its treasury and an important alliance. Though the Russian-American friendship dated back to the 1850s, the French paper concluded, today's ceding of territory by the Russians cannot fail to strengthen the paradoxical relationship between Tsar Alexander and President Johnson. Politicians in Constantinople were also alarmed by the news of the Alaska Purchase for some of the same reasons expressed in France and Prussia. The Ottoman Empire, in particular, feared that the Russian-American alliance would involve the United States taking Russia's side in the Eastern question. The official Ottoman newspaper, La Turquie, compared the announcement to a bomb bursting in the midst of very complicated situations charged with tempests. Turkish officials believed that the Russian-American relationship would operate to the serious detriment of Turkey. And of course, you know, for those of, I'm sure all of you are keenly aware of this, but, you know, during this period of time, the Eastern question was all about what was going to happen to the Ottoman Empire, when it would collapse, how it would collapse, and who would benefit from that collapse. What other nations might have the opportunity to scoop up power. So the idea that the Americans might be getting involved in this question certainly was alarming to Ottoman officials. Now, getting back to the story of the mechanics of the sale. Now, it's important to realize that the legislative process for acquiring Alaska occurred in two steps. So the first step was obtaining the Senate's approval of the treaty. The treaty was presented to the Senate at 10 o'clock in the morning on March 30th, 1867, only 6 hours after it was signed and only 2 hours before the first session of the 40th Congress was set to adjourn at noon. Under these circumstances, these time constraints, it was considered necessary to call a special session of the Senate to be held over the next 3 weeks to consider the treaty. During this period, Seward was hard at work rallying support for his project, holding dinners at his house, and recruiting men of knowledge and reputation to write about their own experiences in Russian America and why it was a valuable acquisition. These testimonials were then published in major newspapers across the country, shaping and influencing the national conversation about the potential of this faraway and little-known territory. Meanwhile, the treaty was referred to the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs, of which Charles Sumner was the chair. Now, Sumner, you will recall, had neither opposed nor supported the treaty when he was told about it the previous night, but he had asked Stoeckel the following morning to consider withdrawing it. But whatever Sumner's initial feelings, when the Foreign Relations Committee met several days later, Sumner seemed to have warmed to the idea. He still had his reservations, especially about the rushed and secretive way the treaty had been negotiated, but he recognized its benefits. Others on the committee also expressed their doubts and concerns, but ultimately the Committee on Foreign Relations agreed to recommend approval of the treaty to the Senate as a whole. That meeting occurred in mid-June, and in it, Sumner gave a speech of some 2 to 3 hours, strongly advocating ratification. Unfortunately, we do not have a transcript of that original speech, but it must have been persuasive because the next day, the Senate ratified the treaty 37-2. With the ratification complete, Seward and Stoeckel could congratulate themselves on a job well done. Stoeckel, however, had found the American process frustrating and exhausting. He complained to the Russian foreign minister back in St. Petersburg with some exaggeration that, quote, it is necessary to confer with some hundreds of individuals, to know almost all of them, to give on one side and another explanations and information, to speak to each one and talk his language to him. He wrote to a friend that the 25,000 silver rubles that he had received for executing the sale of Alaska did not seem sufficient given all the work it had required. But Stoeckel had no idea of the challenges that the Alaska deal still faced. I always think it's sort of humorous that Stoeckel complained about how many people he had to negotiate with, because of course he was coming from the monarchist system where he really, basically if the czar wanted it to happen, it could happen, right? And he was frustrated by the American process that involved so much lobbying and persuading of people who maybe had questions and opposition. So that's always kind of a funny comparison, I think. Now, before the second phase of the treaty process could take place, which was the approval of an appropriation bill by the House of Representatives, the United States actually took possession of Russian America. So on October 18th, 1867, the Russian flag was lowered and the American flag was raised over Sitka, the city that had served as the capital of Russian America. George Foster Emmons, the commander of the ship that had transported the American commissioners to Alaska, described a small ceremony of about 300 people, both Russian and American officials and local residents, the salute of gunfire, and a brief exchange of formalities. The only significant part of the ceremony, or notable part of the ceremony, was the lowering of the Russian flag, which apparently became tangled and tore, and it had to be rescued by a Russian soldier who climbed the pole and ripped it free, dropping it down onto the bayonets of his fellow soldiers below. From this point forward, General Jefferson C. Davis, no relation to the former president of the Confederacy, took control of the region as commander of the Military District of Alaska. In the following weeks, Davis and several Russian officials sorted out other details of the transfer, such as which buildings in Sitka were public and which were private, which was not an easy question to answer since the Russian-American company had been in the practice of housing its employees in company dwellings, which then passed from generation to generation. So figuring out what was public and private was a little more complicated than it sounds. Moreover, although many Russian inhabitants were returning to Russia, there was a significant number who were too old and wanted to stay, and they needed to be provided for. So that was one of the things they had to work out as well. Now, the final step in completing the purchase of Alaska entailed the passage of an appropriation bill to actually pay for the new territory. So this is where the rubber hits the road, right? The House of Representatives possessed the power to approve or deny appropriations, but the manner in which the Alaska Treaty had been handled left the House in a very awkward position. The treaty had been signed and ratified by both countries at the very end of a congressional session. And by the time the next session opened, Alaska had been officially transferred into the hands of the American government. The House's prerogative had almost been eliminated by these actions. And of course, you can imagine that there were politicians who were not happy about this. Now, if the House failed to approve appropriations, it would potentially cause an international scandal and show the U.S. to be an unreliable partner in diplomatic negotiations. The matter was made worse by the tensions between President Johnson and Congress over his imperial style in implementing policies of Reconstruction, a clash that would ultimately lead to an impeachment trial in the spring of 1868. Finally, payment for Alaska was almost derailed by one other matter, the claim of Benjamin Perkins against the Russian government for money lost during a defaulted business deal some 13 years earlier during the Crimean War. All of these complications meant that deliberations over the appropriation bill were heated, both in the House and in the American press. Debate began in the full body of the House on June 30th, 1868. Opponents called the bill foolish, insane, and wicked, and declared that Alaska was worthless. Supporters argued the opposite, though many of those who advocated payment for Alaska were still irritated by the usurpation of the House's powers. In the American press, there was almost universal support for appropriation, and a main source of support was the concern about America's international reputation. The Perkins claim, which I mentioned just a minute ago, was no small matter either. So let's talk just a minute about what this claim was about. In June of 1855, Captain Benjamin Perkins, who was a merchant mariner from Worcester, Massachusetts, met a man who claimed to be an agent of the Russian government tasked with procuring armaments and powder to support the military efforts of Russia in the Crimean War. Over the next few months, Perkins met with several men acting as agents of the Russian government, including Russian Minister Stokel, and secured what he believed to be legitimate agreements. In the meantime, Perkins spent a great deal of money acquiring the materials necessary to fill the order. As the Crimean War came to an end, however, it became apparent that Russia was no longer interested in obtaining the discussed war materials. Left in the lurch, Perkins began to try and recover his declared losses through legal means. And when he died in 1862, his claim was picked up by his wife and daughter, who made several appeals to the Russian and American governments. None of these produced any real results. But in 1867, Anna Perkins, Benjamin's widow, who was destitute and hounded by debts, once again appealed to Congress for help. And this time she had a bit of a hook. Since the United States was in negotiations with Russia for the purchase of Alaska, Mrs. Perkins and her attorneys asked that Congress withhold the sum of over $300,000, actually close to $400,000, plus interest from the payment to Russia, at least until her claim was evaluated once more. Now, this bold proposition raised opposition on both sides. Between July and December of 1867, several politicians presented petitions supporting Mrs. Perkins' request, and the Committee on Foreign Relations actually considered an amendment that would withhold a portion of the $7.2 million until this claim was given reconsideration. As the amendment was being voted upon, however, Stokel intervened and proposed that the amendment be withdrawn in return for his assurances that the claim would be given proper investigation and consideration. In the end, the House passed the appropriation bill 113 to 43, with 44 men choosing not to vote at all. Of the 43 who opposed appropriation, 41 of them had supported Johnson's impeachment earlier that spring. So you can see the political connection there. On July 27th, 1868, the bill appeared in its final form, stating that Congress approved the payment of $7.2 million for Alaska. The next day, Stokel sent a requisition to the Secretary of the Treasury, and 4 days late, Stokel received a Treasury draft for that amount. It had taken 16 months, but the Alaska deal was finally concluded. And while popular history has perpetuated the story about the Alaska purchase as Seward's folly, no one today believes that the purchase was a mistake. In fact, Alaska has proven to be an incredibly valuable acquisition for the United States, both for its natural resources and its spectacular beauty. And its future is often at the center of national debates in the United States. There are even people in Russia who would like to take it back, arguing that the sale was in fact a lease of some sort. Despite the inaccuracy of those claims, The idea of Russia reclaiming Alaska has taken hold with some Russians and encouraged speculation and humor in the United States. There is no reason to believe, however, that the United States will willingly give up Alaska anytime soon. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions at this point. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll also tell you that when Stoeckel left the United States with that promise that the Perkins claim would be reexamined, he was replaced by a Russian minister who had far less tact. His name was Konstantin Catacazy. And he actually ended up being the subject of my last book, my most recent book, which came out in October of last year, because his handling of the Perkins claim, along with some other things, ended up making him so unpopular with the U.S. government that they finally asked for his recall. But because the Tsar's son, Grand Duke Alexis, was on his way to the United States, it was decided that they could not recall him just yet. And so the American government agreed to tolerate this Russian minister until the end of the Grand Duke's visit. And then at that point, he was forced to leave the United States. So the scandal involving sort of the fallout down the road from the Perkins claim ended up being something that I focused on in an entire book. So, okay, so I see some questions popping up now. So what people living in Alaska think about the purchase today. Well, it depends on who you talk to, of course. There are Indigenous peoples there who have opinions about it because, of course, they were not consulted. They lived there and they were not consulted when this sale took place many years ago. And there has been an effort to acknowledge their loss in the 20th century. There was some effort by the United States government to acknowledge the fact that they were, not treated well during this particular transaction. Let's see, who owned Alaska before Russia? Nobody owned Alaska before Russia. There were indigenous peoples living there, of course, but there was no ownership per se, as we think of in modern terms. Was anyone involved in the Treaty of Alaska profiting from it? So, not in the sense that this question is asking, did any politicians own business there or have special interests? No. When everything was said and done, there were lots of accusations, and although no one has been able to draw a clear paper trail, I think it is pretty clear that many politicians were bribed in the process to vote favorably for the appropriations bill. So for example, there's enough evidence to show that Stoeckel probably had the blessing of the Tsar to use some money to pay off certain people in the House of Representatives to vote in favor of the bill so that the appropriations would go through as needed. But I don't think there's any evidence that any politician profited in the direct way that that this question is asking. Let me see if there are any other questions here. Let's see. Okay. Are there any other questions that anybody would like to ask? I have been to Alaska. That's what inspired me to write this book. It is amazingly beautiful. And it is such an interesting blend of, sort of the native indigenous cultures and American influence. In the town of Sitka, there's a lovely Russian Orthodox church as well. And of course, I showed those totem poles, which combined, that kind of like local culture with the Russian influence. So yeah, I highly recommend it if anybody can have the opportunity to go there. Any other questions about, so as I said before, there was no ownership in the traditional sense, right? Because indigenous peoples lived there before Russia started to establish its Russian-American colony there. So this is, the time of exploration and settlement. So there really wasn't any ownership. Any other questions? So again, I'll just say if anybody's interested in this topic, you can go and read the book. There's more information, obviously, in the book than I could present in an hour. The same is true for the story of Grand Duke Alexis's visit to the United States, which is something I also am happy to talk about if anybody ever would like me to do a talk on that, and the more recent book on the Catacazy scandal. No, Canada did not try and buy Alaska. So at this time, Canada was still Great Britain's colonies. That Canada had not yet organized itself into a confederation. That was happening at the same time that Russia and the United States were negotiating for this purchase. Absolutely, absolutely. So again, thank you so much for your attention. If there are no more questions, I hope all of you have a lovely weekend. And I hope one of these days I'll get to visit Minsk. I've never been there, but I surely would love to go sometime.